deed felt thin in Jedediah's hand, a flimsy piece of paper to represent the sum total of his world. $50. The price of a ghost town. The price of solitude. He'd ridden for 3 days from the land office in Bozeman, the Montana sky a vast, unforgiving canvas above him. He'd left behind the whispers and the pitying glances, the memories of a small house filled with laughter that had been silenced by fever years ago. Now all he wanted was the quiet embrace of desolation. Redemption Gulch. The name was a bitter joke, but the location was perfect. Tucked away in a fold of the granite hills, forgotten by the gold rush that had birthed it and the railroad that had bypassed it. As his horse Goliath crested the final rise, Jed saw it. Skeletal Main Street, lined with the hollowed-out promises of a better life. A general store with a caved-in roof, a blacksmith's shop surrendering to rust, and at the far end a 2-story saloon, its sign creaking a lonely rhythm in the wind. This was it, the kingdom of his isolation. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning in the silence. Dust, thick and fine as flour, puffed up around his boot. The air smelled of sagebrush and sun-baked decay. It was perfect. A place where a man could be alone with his ghosts without making any new ones. He tied Goliath to a hitching post that looked strong enough to crumble if a strong wind blew. His plan was simple: claim the saloon as his own. It was the largest, most structurally sound building. He'd patch the roof, board the windows, and live out his days with the wind as his only neighbor. He walked the length of the street, his spurs the only sound, each footstep an assertion of his ownership. He was the king of this crumbling empire of dust. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, a chill crept into the air. Jed pulled his duster tighter and headed for the saloon. He pushed open the batwing doors, which protested with a shriek of dry-rotted wood. The inside was a cavern of shadows, smelling of stale beer and regret. Moonlight streamed through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom. He unslung his bedroll and lantern, placing them on the long warp bar. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light chasing the shadows into the corners. The lantern's glow revealed the room in all its faded glory. Overturned tables, a broken piano with yellowed keys, and a glittering constellation of shattered glass on the floor. He was about to start clearing a space when he saw it. A flicker, not from his lantern, from the back of the saloon near the stairs leading to the upper floor. He froze, hand instinctively dropping to the cold peacemaker at his hip. A trick of the light? A reflection? Then he heard it. A soft sound quickly stifled. A cough. Jedediah Stone, who had paid for solitude, was not alone. He lifted the lantern high, its light cutting a swath through the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice a low growl that sounded foreign in the dead quiet. Silence answered him, the heavy, listening kind of silence. "I own this town," he stated, his voice harder this time. "This building, every nail and splinter. Show yourself." A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jed moved slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching on the glass. He placed the lantern on a rickety table, freeing both his hands. He drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing in the vast room. He was a man who wanted nothing, which meant he had nothing left to lose. He would not be trifled with. "Last chance," he warned, his eyes scanning the shadowed landing at the top of the stairs. A voice, small and trembling, finally broke the tension. "Please, don't shoot! There are children!" A woman. The word hung in the air, an unwelcome intrusion. Children. Even worse. They were the very specters of the life he had fled. A figure emerged from the shadows at the top of the stairs. A woman in a worn, patched dress, her hair a messy braid that had come partially undone. She was thin, her face pale in the lantern light, but her eyes held a desperate, fierce light. She held a heavy cast-iron skillet like a shield. Behind her skirts, 2 smaller figures huddled, their wide, frightened eyes peering at him. "This is our home," the woman said, her voice shaking but resolute. Jed lowered his pistol, though he did not holster it. His heart, a cold, hard knot in his chest, gave a painful thud. He had bought a ghost town for $50, a pittance, for the promise of absolute solitude. But the town wasn't empty, and he had just found a widow with her children living in the heart of his desolation. The woman descended the stairs slowly, one measured step at a time, never taking her eyes off him. The skillet remained raised, a pathetic but determined defense against the armed man who had invaded her world. The two children, a boy and a girl, clung to her dress, their small forms a silent accusation. "You're home?" Jed's voice was rough, laced with disbelief and a deep, rising frustration. "Ma'am, this is Redemption Gulch. The only thing living here for the past 10 years has been coyotes and memories. I have the deed, signed and sealed in Bozeman." He gestured with his free hand toward the bar where his saddlebags lay. The paper was in there, the legal proof that her reality was a trespass upon his. "We have been here for 6 months, she countered, her chin lifting a fraction. "Since my husband, since he passed. We had nowhere else to go." Her name was Elara Vance. Her husband, a prospector with more hope than sense, had chased a rumor of a lost silver vein into these hills. He'd brought his family with him, promising a fortune. Instead, he'd found a rattlesnake bite and a lonely grave, leaving Elara with 3 children and the crushing weight of his failed dreams. "There's a third one," she added, her voice softening as she glanced behind her. A tiny, sleepy face with a thumb in its mouth peeked around her leg, a boy no older than 4. Jed's gaze swept over them. The oldest boy, maybe 10, stood slightly in front of his mother, his small fists clenched, trying to project a strength he didn't possess. The girl, a few years younger, hid her face in her mother's skirt, her shoulders trembling, and the little one, oblivious to the danger, just looked tired. A family, a mirror of the one he'd lost, fractured and desperate, but a family nonetheless. The sight was a punch to the gut. This was not the welcome he had envisioned. His kingdom of quiet was filled with the one thing he could no longer bear, the raw, messy, and demanding presence of life. "That's not my concern," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was trying to summon the coldness that had been his shield for years. "The law says this is my property. You're trespassing." Elara's eyes flashed with a spark of anger that momentarily burned away the fear. "The law? Where was the law when my Thomas died? Where was the law when we were starving in a wagon with a broken wheel? This place, this forgotten place, was our sanctuary. We harm no one." "You're harming me," Jed stated flatly, holstering his Colt with a final, decisive thud. The sound seemed to break the spell. The woman, Elara, flinched. "I came here for peace, for quiet." He saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes, the recognition of a pain similar to her own. But her situation was more immediate, more desperate. "We have no food left but a handful of flour," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "No money. The nearest town is 2 days' walk. I can't make that journey with them." She looked down at her children, her expression a mixture of fierce love and utter despair. "We will die on the trail." Jedediah stared at her, the cold armor around his heart beginning to crack. He saw not an intruder but a reflection of his own past helplessness. He remembered praying, bargaining with a silent God as his wife and daughter faded before his eyes. He had been powerless then, and this woman was powerless now. He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of his carefully constructed world crumbling. He had bought a ghost town to escape his humanity, and it had led him right to the doorstep of someone else's. "One night," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can stay the night. It's cold and there are predators, but in the morning you have to be gone." It was a compromise he hadn't intended to make, a crack in the fortress of his solitude. Elara nodded, her shoulders slumping with a relief so profound it was almost painful to watch. "Thank you," she breathed. The heavy skillet was lowered to her side. "Thank you." She herded her children back up the stairs, their bare feet silent on the dusty wood. Jed stood alone in the center of the saloon, the lantern light casting his long, lonely shadow against the wall. The silence he craved returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of heartbeats from the floor above. He ran a hand over his weary face. His $50 kingdom had come with a complication he could have never anticipated. The sun rose harsh and white, pouring through the saloon's grimy windows and painting stripes of light across the dusty floor. Jed had not slept well. He'd laid out his bedroll on the far side of the room, the scent of wood smoke from the family's small makeshift hearth upstairs a constant reminder of their presence. Every creak of the floorboards, every muffled cough had been an intrusion. He was already up, stoking the embers of a small fire he'd built in the saloon's main fireplace. He'd found a half-gal sack of coffee beans in his saddlebags, and the aroma was just beginning to fill the air, a civilized scent in a savage place. He was a man of routine, and this was his. He would have his coffee, eat a piece of hardtack, and then he would enforce the terms of his agreement. They had to leave. He heard movement upstairs, the soft murmur of a mother waking her children. He steeled himself, rehearsing the words. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but a deal's a deal." It sounded hollow even in his own mind. Elara appeared at the top of the stairs, not with the skillet but with a bucket. She moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life with no wasted movements. She saw him by the fire, nodded a silent, wary greeting, and proceeded down and out the back door, presumably to the town's well. The children followed a few minutes later, drawn by the smell of the coffee and the warmth of the fire. The oldest boy, who Elara had called Caleb, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed. He had his father's watchfulness and his mother's determined chin. "My pa used to drink coffee," Caleb said, the statement both an observation and a challenge. Jed grunted, not looking up from the pot. "Did he now?" "Was looking for silver," the boy continued, taking a step closer. "He said we were all going to be rich. Said he'd buy Ma a silk dress from St. Louis." Jed poured the steaming black liquid into his tin cup. The boy's words were ghosts of promises Jed himself had once made. "I'll build you a bigger house, Sarah, a real porch swing." He took a sip of the bitter coffee, the heat, a welcome burn. The little girl, Leah, crept closer, her thumb finding its way to her mouth as she stared at the fire. The youngest, Samuel, toddled over and pointed a chubby finger at Jed's cup. "Hot," he stated with profound certainty. Before Jed could respond, Elara returned, the bucket full of water. She saw her children gathered around him and her posture stiffened. "Caleb, Leah, come away from the man," she ordered softly. "He made coffee, Ma," Caleb said, not moving. Elara set the bucket down. The lines of exhaustion were etched deeper into her face in the morning light. "We have nothing to trade for coffee, son." Jed looked from the mother to the children. He saw their pinched faces, the hollows under their eyes. His gaze fell on his saddlebags, where he had a slab of bacon and another half-dozen pieces of hardtack. It was meant to last him a week. He let out a sigh that seemed to come from the soles of his boots. He had survived years of loneliness. He wasn't sure he could survive a few hours of watching children starve. "There's a sack of flour on my horse," he said, his voice gruff to hide the concession. "And some bacon. You can have some. For the trail." He added the last part to remind her and himself of the arrangement. Elara's expression was a mix of suspicion and desperate gratitude. "We can't." "I'm not asking," Jed cut in, standing up. "It's a long walk to anywhere from here. The children need to eat." He strode out of the saloon, feeling their eyes on his back. He was just being practical, he told himself, a pragmatic solution to a temporary problem. He returned with the flour and the slab of bacon, placing them on the bar without a word. Elara stared at the provisions as if they were gold nuggets. Then she looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "God bless you, sir," she whispered. Jed just grunted and turned back to his coffee. He watched as she moved with a sudden burst of energy. She produced a small sack of her own, containing a pathetic amount of flour, and combined it with his. She mixed it with water from the well and, using the skillet she'd threatened him with, began to make flatbreads on the hearth. She sliced off a few precious slivers of bacon, the sizzle and smell filling the saloon with a sense of life it hadn't known in years. When the food was ready, she gave the first, largest portions to her children, who ate with a quiet, desperate ferocity. Then she walked over to him and offered him a piece of the flatbread with a sliver of bacon on top. "Your share," she said. He hadn't expected it. He was about to refuse, but the look on her face, the simple dignity in the gesture, stopped him. He took the food. It was warm and savory, 1,000 times better than the cold hardtack he had planned to eat. They ate in silence, a strange, temporary family sharing a meal in the ruins of a dead town. An unspoken truce settled over the room, as fragile and as warm as the morning sun. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to curdle in the west. By midday, a bruised purple line of clouds was advancing on Redemption Gulch, pregnant with a storm. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the buildings, kicking up dust devils that danced down the main street. Jedediah, who knew the moods of the Montana sky as well as he knew his own sour disposition, recognized the sign. This wasn't a passing shower. This was a proper squall, the kind that could drop a foot of rain and turn the dry earth into a treacherous sea of mud. Elara and her children were packing their meager belongings into a tattered canvas sack. A spare dress for her, a few worn toys for the children, a dented tin pot. Jed watched them from the doorway of the saloon, the wind whipping his duster around his legs. "You can't leave now," he stated, his back to them. It wasn't a question. Elara stopped, her hands stilling on a folded blanket. "We have to, you said." "I said you had to leave this morning," he cut her off, turning to face them. He pointed a long finger at the ominous sky. "You walk out into that, and you're trading a roof for a grave. The gullies will flash flood. You'll be soaked to the bone in minutes. A chill like that will kill the little one before nightfall." Every word was a hammer blow of truth, and she knew it. Fear warred with pride on her face. To stay was to accept another kindness from this grim stranger, to sink deeper into a debt she could never repay. To leave was to risk her children's lives. "We will be fine," Caleb piped up, his voice thin against the rising wind. "I can find us shelter." Jed's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at the boy. "Courage is a good thing, son, but it's a poor substitute for a solid roof." The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splatting into the dust like dark coins. Within moments, it was a downpour, a torrential sheet of water that blurred the world outside the saloon doors. The temperature dropped. The wind moaned like a dying animal. There was no more argument. The decision had been made for them. Elara sank onto a dusty crate, the fight visibly leaving her. The children, sensing the change, huddled close to her. "The roof on this place is mostly intact," Jed said, pushing the groaning batwing door shut and dropping the heavy crossbar into place, plunging the room into a dim, protected twilight. "But the east corner leaks. We'll need to move your things." For the rest of the afternoon, they worked. It was an unspoken, necessary collaboration. Jed, with his strength, moved the heavier debris, clearing a larger, drier space near the main fireplace. Elara, with her quiet efficiency, swept and cleaned, creating an island of order in the chaos. Caleb, eager to prove his worth, hauled small pieces of wood Jed chopped from a broken table, building up a supply for the fire. Even little Leah helped, picking up smaller bits of shattered glass with painstaking care. As the storm raged outside, a strange sense of domesticity settled within the saloon's walls. The fire crackled, a warm and living heart in the cavernous room. The rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the roof, isolating them completely from the outside world. That evening, as they shared another simple meal of flatbread and the last of the bacon, the silence was different. It was no longer tense or wary, but comfortable. "Why did you come here?" Elara asked softly, her eyes on the fire. "To a place like this?" Jed was quiet for a long time, listening to the storm. He hadn't spoken of his past to anyone in years, but here, in this pocket of time, cut off from everything, the words began to surface. "I had a family," he said, his voice low and raspy. "A wife, Sarah, and a little girl, Martha." He stared into the flames, seeing their faces. "We had a small ranch east of the Bighorns. It was a good life." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then the fever came. Took 'em both in the space of a week. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't do anything." He clenched his fist. "After that, the world felt too loud, too full of people. I just wanted less." Lara listened, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. "My Thomas," she began, her own voice thick with memory. "He was a good man, a dreamer. He was always so sure our fortune was just over the next hill." She managed a sad smile. "He read about this place in an old newspaper, Redemption Gulch. He thought the name was a sign. He died digging a hole not 50 yards from where we're sitting, looking for silver that was never there." In the flickering firelight, they were no longer just a rancher and a widow. They were two people, shipwrecked by life, who had washed up on the same desolate shore. They had shared their stories, the raw, painful truths of their existence. The storm had not only forced them together physically, but had stripped away their defenses, leaving them bound by a shared understanding of loss. An uneasy alliance, born of necessity, was slowly being forged into something else, something that felt dangerously close to trust. The storm broke before dawn. When Jed unbarred the doors, the world was washed clean. The air, scrubbed of dust, smelled of wet earth and pine. The rising sun struck the damp wood of the buildings, making the ghost town gleam as if it were new. But the storm had taken its toll. A large section of shingles on the saloon's east corner had been torn away, and a steady drip, drip, drip of water was creating a new puddle on the floor. During the night, Jed had lain awake, listening to that sound. It was the sound of decay, the sound of his shelter failing. He found his hammer and a pouch of nails he'd brought for minor repairs. He surveyed the roof from the street, his eyes tracing the path of the damage. It was a two-man job, and a dangerous one at that. Elara was outside, wringing out blankets and hanging them over the hitching post to dry in the strengthening sun. She watched him. "It's a bad leak," she stated. "It'll rot the main beam if I leave it," he replied, not looking at her. He eyed the rickety ladder leaning against the blacksmith shop. It looked as old as the town itself. "I can help," she offered. Jed turned, a skeptical look on his face. "It's no place for a woman, ma'am. One slip." "I am stronger than I look," she said, a familiar spark in her eyes. "And I am not afraid of heights. I will not be a burden in this place. I will earn our keep until the trails are dry enough for us to travel." Before he could argue, Caleb stepped forward. "I can help too. I'm a good climber." Jed looked from the determined mother to her equally determined son. He saw not a nuisance, but an echo of the self-reliance he valued. He was still a man who craved solitude, but the thought of patching this roof alone while they watched felt wrong. It was no longer just his roof. It was theirs too, for now. "All right, son," he said, nodding at Caleb. "You can haul the shingles. Your ma can hold the ladder steady, but you do exactly as I say. Understood?" Caleb's face lit up with pride. "Yes, sir." The work was slow and arduous. Jed found a stack of old, weathered shingles behind the general store. Many cracked, but some still usable. He showed Caleb how to inspect them, how to stack the good ones. The boy worked with a seriousness that belied his age, his small face set in a mask of concentration. Elara, true to her word, held the base of the ancient ladder with a firm, steady grip. As Jed climbed onto the slippery roof, her presence at the bottom was a silent, grounding force. He felt it, a strange sense of reassurance he hadn't known he was missing. He worked for hours under the hot sun, tearing away the rotten wood and nailing the new shingles into place. Caleb was a tireless worker, climbing the lower rungs of the ladder to hand his mother a few shingles at a time, which she would then pass up to Jed. They formed a small, efficient team. At one point, Jed's hammer slipped from his sweaty grasp and skittered down the steep pitch of the roof. Before he could even curse, Caleb scrambled to retrieve it from the muddy ground. He cleaned the handle on his shirt before handing it back up. "Thank you, Caleb," Jed said, and the words felt natural. "You're welcome, Mr. Stone," the boy replied, beaming. Later, as Jed was nailing the final shingle, he paused and looked down. Elara was looking up at him, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. The children were sitting on the steps of the saloon, watching. For the first time, Jed didn't see intruders. He saw a picture, a family, and he was in it, a part of it, perched on the roof of their shared home. The thought was unsettling, but not entirely unpleasant. He had come to this place to be the lonely king of a dead town. But as he hammered the last nail home, securing the roof not just for himself but for them, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since the fever. The simple, solid satisfaction of protecting someone other than himself. The freshly patched roof held, but their larder was bare. The shared meal after the storm had finished the last of Jed's bacon and Elara's flour. All they had left was Jed's coffee and the dregs of Elara's meager supplies, a few withered potatoes and some salt. It wasn't enough. Winter was still a distant threat, but starvation was a clear and present danger. "I have to ride to Prairie Point," Jed announced one morning, standing by the saloon door. "It's the nearest town with a general store. A day's ride there, a day back if I push it." A knot of anxiety tightened in Elara's stomach. The thought of being left alone in this vast, empty wilderness was terrifying. Jed, for all his gruffness, had become a shield. His presence was a bulwark against the dangers, both real and imagined, that lurked just beyond the edge of town. "We have some money," she said quickly, untying a small leather pouch from her belt. It was shockingly light. "Thomas left this, it's not much." She poured the contents into her palm. A few coins, maybe $3 in total, the last of her worldly possessions. Jed looked at the paltry sum, then at her face. He shook his head. "Keep it. You'll need it." He didn't have much more himself, but he had a horse and a gun, and that was currency enough in this part of the world. "I'll manage." "Take it," she insisted, her pride wounded. "We do not take charity, Mr. Stone." "It's not charity, ma'am," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's an investment in my property. I can't have my tenants wasting away. It's bad for property value. The corner of her mouth twitched in a near smile. It was his way of letting her keep her dignity. "Be careful, Jedediah," she said, using his full name for the first time. The name, spoken in her voice, sounded different, less like the name of a man in mourning and more like the name of a man who is needed. "I will," he promised. He saddled Goliath, strapping empty canvas bags behind his bedroll. Caleb came to stand beside the big horse, stroking its nose. "You'll be the man of the house while I'm gone," Jed told him, checking the cinch. "Look after your mother and your sisters." He didn't mean to say sisters, but the word came out. He saw the flicker in Elara's eyes. Caleb stood up straighter. "I will. I have Pa's old rifle." Jed stopped. "Show me." Caleb ran inside and returned with a long, heavy Kentucky rifle. It was old and the stock was scarred. Jed took it, his expert hands checking the mechanism. It was clean, well-oiled. "Your pa taught you how to use this?" "Yes, sir. He said a man has to protect his own." "He was right," Jed said, handing it back. "But you only use it if you have no other choice. You hear me? You keep your family safe inside. Bar the door at night. Don't go looking for trouble." "Yes, sir," Caleb said, his eyes serious. Jed mounted Goliath. He looked down at the small family gathered in the street. Elara stood with her arms wrapped around Leah and Samuel, her face a mask of worry. For a man who had wanted nothing more than to be alone, leaving felt surprisingly difficult. He felt a fierce, unfamiliar pull of responsibility. "I'll be back before the second sunset," he said to Elara. It was a promise. He nudged Goliath with his heels, and the horse moved into a steady trot, kicking up dust as they headed out of town. Elara watched him go until he was just a small speck on the vast, empty prairie. The silence he left behind was immense, a heavy blanket that smothered the newfound sense of life in the town. She gathered her children and herded them back inside the saloon, the weight of their survival resting squarely on her shoulders once more. The sound of Jed's hammer on the roof had been replaced by the anxious thumping of her own heart. The first day of Jed's absence passed in a flurry of nervous activity. Elara was determined to show him she was not helpless. She scrubbed the saloon floors with water from the well until the wood gleamed. She mended tears in the children's clothes with thread pulled from her own hem. She sent Caleb and Leah out to gather firewood, instructing them not to stray beyond the line of the old livery stable. She kept busy to keep the fear at bay. As dusk settled, the familiar shadows of Redemption Gulch seemed longer, more menacing. Every creak of the old buildings, every rustle in the sagebrush, sounded like a threat. Elara barred the saloon door just as Jed had instructed. She laid out the children on their bed of blankets near the fire and sat with the old rifle across her lap, her ears straining to hear over the crackle of the flames. Caleb, sensing her fear, sat beside her. "I'm not scared, Ma." "I know you're not," she lied, stroking his hair. "You're brave, like your father." Later that night, long after the children had fallen asleep, she heard a scratching sound coming from the back of the saloon near the storeroom where they kept their meager supplies. It wasn't the sound of a rat. It was heavier, deliberate. Her heart leapt into her throat. She gripped the rifle, her knuckles white. She motioned for Caleb, who was dozing by the fire, to stay quiet. He woke instantly, his eyes wide. The scratching stopped. A low, guttural snuffle followed, then a whine. Coyotes. A whole pack, by the sound of it, drawn by the lingering scent of their food, or perhaps just by the smell of life in a place that should have been dead. A heavy body thumped against the storeroom's flimsy back door. Elara's blood ran cold. That door was old, the wood soft with rot. It wouldn't hold for long. "Ma?" Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. "Stay with your brother and sister," she commanded, her own voice a strained whisper. "Get behind the bar, now." He hesitated, his eyes on the rifle. "Let me help." "You'll help by keeping them safe," she insisted. "Do as I say, Caleb." He scrambled to obey, pulling a sleepy Leah and Samuel with him into the relative safety of the heavy wooden bar. Elara crept toward the back of the saloon, the heavy rifle awkward in her hands. The scratching became more frantic, accompanied by snarling and yips from the rest of the pack. She could hear the wood of the door splintering. She rested the long barrel of the rifle on a crate, just as her Thomas had taught her. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to still her shaking hands. Aim for the biggest shadow. Don't think, just do. With a final, violent crack, one of the door's planks gave way. A dark snout, followed by a pair of gleaming yellow eyes, pushed through the opening. The animal, emboldened by its success, tried to squeeze its way inside. Elara pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The rifle kicked back hard, slamming into her shoulder and knocking her to the floor. The saloon filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Outside, the snarling turned to panicked yelps as the pack scattered into the night. Silence descended, broken only by Samuel's terrified wails from behind the bar. Elara pushed herself up, her shoulder throbbing, her ears ringing. Through the hole in the door, she could see the dark shapes of the coyotes retreating into the hills. She had done it. She had protected her family. She leaned against the wall, the heavy rifle sliding from her grasp, and began to tremble, the adrenaline giving way to shock. She was no longer just a widow, a victim of fate. She was a survivor, and she would do whatever it took to keep her children safe in this unforgiving land. Jed pushed Goliath hard on the return journey. The canvas bags were heavy with flour, beans, salt, and smoked meat. He'd even traded one of his better knives for a small keg of molasses and a bolt of sturdy wool cloth. He told himself it was a practical purchase for the coming winter, but as he rode, he saw Leah's patched dress and Elara's thin shawl in his mind's eye. An unfamiliar urgency spurred him on. It wasn't just the promise of returning by the second sunset. It was a deeper, more personal need to see that they were safe. The solitude of the trail, once a comfort, now felt like a hollow ache. The silence was filled with his imaginings of what could go wrong in his absence. He saw the smoke from the saloon's chimney before he saw the town itself, a thin gray plume against the vast blue sky. A knot of tension in his chest loosened. Smoke meant a fire. A fire meant they were all right. As he rode down the main street, the saloon door opened and Caleb came running out, his face alight with relief. "Mr. Stone, you're back!" Leah and Samuel were right behind him. Jed swung down from Goliath before the horse had even stopped and found himself surrounded. Leah hugged his leg, a gesture of simple, trusting affection that struck him with the force of a physical blow. "We missed you," she said into his dusty jeans. Jed stood frozen for a moment, his hand hovering awkwardly over her head before he gently patted her hair. He looked over her head to the saloon doorway where Elara stood, her face pale but her eyes shining with relief. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his gaze searching hers. "We're fine," she said, her voice steady. "We managed." It wasn't until he was unstrapping the supplies that Caleb, bursting with the need to tell the story, recounted the events of the previous night. "And Ma?" She took Pa's rifle, and she waited until it poked its head through the door, and bam! The boy's eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "She shot it right in the face. The others all ran away. She saved us." Jed stopped what he was doing and looked at Elara. He saw the faint bruise on her shoulder from the rifle's kick. He walked over to the back storeroom and saw the splintered door, the dark stain on the ground outside. He imagined her, alone, facing down a pack of hungry predators to protect her children. A wave of fierce admiration washed over him, followed by a sharp pang of guilt for having left them vulnerable. He had underestimated her. He had seen her as a damsel in distress, a problem to be managed. He had been wrong. She was a fortress. He turned back to her, the weight of his new understanding in his eyes. He said nothing, but the look that passed between them was more potent than words. It was a look of shared respect, of a bond forged in the crucible of this harsh land. Later, after he'd stored the provisions, he pulled 2 items from his saddlebag that he had kept separate. He walked over to where the children were sitting. He handed a small, beautifully carved wooden horse to Caleb. "A good knife is earned, not given," he said gruffly. "But a man needs to know how to whittle. This is to practice with." He then knelt down in front of Leah, who looked at him with wide, curious eyes. He produced a small doll simply made of cloth and yarn, but with a carefully stitched smile and blue bubble eyes. Her gasp was a tiny, joyous thing. She clutched the doll to her chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. He stood up and looked at Elara, who had watched the exchange with tears in her eyes. "The bolt of cloth is on the bar," he said quietly, "for winter clothes, for all of you." He hadn't just brought back supplies, he had brought back gifts. He had brought back proof that while he was away, they were not far from his thoughts. In that moment, standing in the middle of the saloon, surrounded by the family he never wanted, Jedediah Stone felt the last icy walls around his heart begin to melt away. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a place coming back to life. The ghost town was slowly shedding its skin of decay, animated by the purpose of the 5 people who now called it home. Jedediah's mission of solitude had been unconsciously, irrevocably transformed into a mission of survival, and then into something that looked remarkably like building a home. Jed, with Caleb as his ever-present apprentice, began the larger work of making the town habitable for the coming winter. They patched the roof of the livery stable to store the firewood they were gathering. They cleaned the thick sludge from the bottom of the town well, and the water that filled it now ran clean and sweet. Jed taught Caleb how to set a snare, and the boy's pride when he caught his first rabbit was a palpable thing. Elara, in turn, transformed the cavernous, broken-down saloon into a home. Using the wool cloth Jed had brought, she sewed warm winter shirts for the boys and a new dress for Leah. She worked tirelessly, her hands always busy. She discovered a small, untended patch of hardy herbs behind the assayer's office and used them to bring flavor to their simple meals of beans and rabbit stew. The scent of cooking food now permanently replaced the smell of dust and regret in the saloon. She and Jed worked around each other with an easy, unspoken understanding. He would chop a mountain of firewood and she would have a hot meal and coffee waiting for him. She would mend a tear in his shirt without being asked, and he would repair a loose floorboard she had tripped on without being told. They were partners, their roles defined not by words, but by the shared daily work of living. One afternoon, Jed found Elara behind the saloon, turning over a patch of hard-packed earth with a broken shovel head. "What are you doing?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Planting," she said, not looking up from her work. She gestured to a small pouch on the ground. "When we first got here, I found some seeds in the general store, in a tin, protected from the mice. Carrots, turnips, hardy root vegetables. It's late in the season, but if we get an early snow, it might protect them long enough to grow." It was a gamble, an act of pure, stubborn hope. Jed watched her for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration as she broke up the stubborn soil. He walked over, took the shovel head from her hand, and plunged it into the earth with his booted foot, turning over a large clump of dirt with one powerful movement. "You're going to break your back doing it that way," he said. "Let me." They worked together for the rest of the day, turning the soil, clearing the rocks, and planting the precious seeds in neat rows. As the sun began to set, they stood back and looked at their work, a small dark rectangle of possibility carved into the barren ground. "Thomas always said I could make anything grow," Elara said softly. "It's a good skill to have," Jed replied. He looked at her, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw from the work. He saw not a fragile widow, but a woman of incredible strength and resilience. He saw the way the setting sun caught the gold in her hair. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the day's labor. The ghost town was no longer silent. It was filled with the sound of children's laughter as Leah chased Samuel around the newly planted garden. It was filled with the rhythmic thud of Jed's axe and the soft hum of Elara's voice as she sang to herself while she worked. Redemption Gulch was becoming their town. The implicit promise they were all working toward was no longer just about surviving the winter. It was about building a future, together, in the heart of the wilderness, that had tried to break them both. The peace was shattered on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air had the sharp bite of impending winter. Jed was teaching Caleb how to properly sight a rifle using a row of tin cans on a fence post when they saw the rider. He was a stranger, dressed not in the dusty, practical clothes of a rancher or a prospector, but in a city suit and a derby hat that looked absurdly out of place. He rode a fine-looking bay horse, and he moved with an air of officious self-importance. He reined in at the edge of town, his eyes sweeping over the signs of life, the patched roof, the wisp of chimney smoke, the small garden plot, with a look of undisguised disdain. "Hello, the house," he called out, his voice thin and reedy. Jed stood up slowly, placing himself between the stranger and the saloon, where Elara had appeared in the doorway. He motioned for Caleb to go inside. "Can I help you?" Jed asked, his voice a low rumble of warning. The man dismounted, pulling a leather folio from his saddlebag. "My name is Silas Croft," he announced, as if the name should mean something. "I am a representative of the Montana and Pacific Railroad Development Company." He strode forward, his polished city boots kicking up clouds of the dust he so clearly despised. "I'm here to survey this land. Our company holds the primary claim to this entire valley, including this collection of hovels." Jed's body went rigid. "That's not possible. I have the deed, bought and paid for from the Territorial Land Office." Croft gave a short, condescending laugh. "Ah, a homesteader's deed, a common mistake. You see, sir, a railroad grant signed by the president himself predates any and all subsequent claims. Your $50 piece of paper, I'm afraid, is worthless." He patted his folio. "My claim, on the other hand, is iron." Elara stepped forward, her face pale. "What does this mean?" Croft's gaze flickered to her, taking in her worn dress and the children hiding behind her skirts. "It means, madam, that you are all squatters on railroad property." He turned his attention back to Jed, his tone hardening. "Our survey teams will be arriving within the week to plat the route for a new spur line. We require this land to be vacated immediately." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The home they had painstakingly carved from the wilderness was being stolen from them with a piece of paper and a smug smile. All their work, their shared hope, the fragile future they had just begun to imagine, all of it was about to be obliterated. "You can't just throw us out," Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. His hand drifted almost unconsciously to rest near the butt of his Colt. Croft saw the movement and his eyes narrowed. "I can, and I will. I have the law on my side. If you resist, I will return with the county sheriff and a warrant for your arrest. You are on our land, Mr. Stone," Jed supplied, his jaw tight. "Jedediah Stone." "Well, Mr. Stone," Croft said, a sneer playing on his lips, "you have 48 hours to gather your possessions and your family and be gone. After that, anything left here will be cleared, by force if necessary." He tipped his derby hat in a mocking gesture toward Elara, turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered dreams in his wake. Jed stood frozen, the tin cans on the fence post forgotten. He stared at the spot where Croft had disappeared, a cold, familiar rage building in his chest. For years he had run from the fight. He had sought peace in emptiness. But this man, this railroad, wasn't just threatening a piece of land. He was threatening Elara. He was threatening Caleb and Leah and Samuel. He was threatening Jed's home, his family. The lonely rancher was gone. In his place stood a man with something to lose, and he would not lose it without a fight. The ultimatum hung in the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. 48 hours. The words echoed in the sudden, crushing silence of the town. The life they had breathed back into Redemption Gulch seemed to seep away, leaving behind the cold shell of a ghost town once more. Inside the saloon, the mood was somber. Elara moved about mechanically, her hands performing familiar tasks, but her eyes were distant, filled with a familiar despair. Caleb sat on the stairs, his head in his hands, the brief shining pride of being the man of the house extinguished. "We could go," Elara said, her voice barely a whisper. "Head west, to Oregon maybe. People say there's good land there." The words were hollow. They both knew it. They had no money, no wagon, and winter was closing in. To leave now was to walk into a death sentence, a slow, freezing demise on the trail. Jed, who had been staring into the cold fireplace, turned to face her. The weariness was gone from his face, replaced by a grim, unyielding resolve. "No," he said, the word as solid as granite. "We're not running." "But he has the law, Jedediah," she argued, her voice breaking. "The railroad. They are more powerful than we can imagine. What can we possibly do?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, beginning to pace the length of the room. "But I paid for this land. I worked this land. You've bled for this land." He stopped and looked at her, his eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. "It's ours. I won't let some suit-wearing thief take it from us." This was not the man who had bought a town to be alone. This was a man fighting for his world, and she, Elara, was at the center of it. A flicker of hope ignited within her. "What is your plan?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "He's arrogant," Jed reasoned, thinking aloud. "He thinks we're just ignorant squatters who will scatter at the first sign of trouble. He's not expecting a real fight." He ran a hand through his hair. "And he mentioned the town charter. That's it. An old prospector in Bozeman told me stories. These old mining towns, they had their own laws, their own charters, granted by the territory before the big companies moved in." His eyes lit up with a sudden, desperate idea. The assayer's office. It would have served as the town hall. If there is a charter, a record of the original claim, it would be there. Hope, fragile but fierce, surged through the room. While Jed headed for the assayer's office, a dusty, cobweb-choked building at the other end of the street, Elara and Caleb began to prepare. They were no longer victims waiting for the axe to fall. They were a family, preparing to defend their home. Elara filled every available bucket and pot with water from the well. Caleb, his purpose restored, helped her haul them into the saloon. They gathered stones, anything that could be thrown from a second-story window. It was a pathetic arsenal, but it was theirs. Jed spent hours in the assayer's office, coughing in the thick dust, prying open rusted filing cabinets and water-damaged trunks. He found ledgers detailing long-forgotten gold claims, letters yellowed with age, but no charter. As dusk fell, he was about to give up when his foot caught on a loose floorboard. He knelt and, using the tip of his knife, pried it up. Beneath it was a small tin lockbox. It was rusted shut. He carried it back to the saloon like a holy relic and, using his hammer, broke the lock. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a rolled-up piece of parchment, tied with a brittle ribbon and sealed with the official wax seal of the Montana Territory. He unrolled it carefully. It was the original town charter for Redemption Gulch, dated 1866. It granted the founders of the town and their legal successors ownership of the land and, crucially, all mineral and water rights in perpetuity. His deed, bought from the land office, made him the legal successor. He looked at Elara, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "I think, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that our Mr. Croft has made a very big mistake. They didn't have much, but they had the law, the real law, and they were ready for the confrontation." The morning of the second day dawned cold and gray. A nervous tension gripped Redemption Gulch. Jed stood on the porch of the saloon, the charter tucked safely inside his shirt, his Colt strapped to his hip. He was not a man looking for violence, but he was prepared for it. Elara and the children remained inside, watching from the window. Around mid-morning, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. It was Silas Croft, and beside him rode a burly man with a tin star pinned to his vest, the county sheriff. "This is it," Jed said quietly to Elara through the open door. "Stay inside, no matter what." Croft and the sheriff reined in a few yards from the saloon. The sheriff, a man with a weary, weathered face, looked around the town, his gaze lingering on the signs of life. "Stone," Croft called out, his voice smug and victorious. "Your time is up. I've brought Sheriff Miller to ensure a peaceful transition. I suggest you don't make this difficult." Jed didn't move from the porch. "Sheriff," he said, addressing the other man directly and ignoring Croft, "my name is Jedediah Stone. I own this town." "Now see here," Croft sputtered. "I showed you the grant, Sheriff. This man is a trespasser." Sheriff Miller dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Jed. "Son, the railroad has a powerful claim. I'm just here to enforce the law." "That's all I'm asking you to do," Jed said calmly. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the rolled parchment. "I believe this is the law you're looking for." He walked down the steps and handed the charter to the sheriff. Croft scoffed. "What is that nonsense? Some faded piece of paper?" The sheriff ignored him, carefully unrolling the document. He read it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He read it again, his eyes moving from the text to the official seal. He looked up at Croft, his expression unreadable. "This is the original territorial charter for Redemption Gulch," Miller stated, his voice flat. "That grants the owner of this claim full and perpetual rights to the land and water." He looked back at Jed. "And you have the deed of succession." "In my pocket, signed and sealed by the land office in Bozeman," Jed confirmed. Sheriff Miller slowly rolled the charter back up and handed it to Jed. He then turned to face a stunned Silas Croft. "Mr. Croft," the sheriff said, his voice now holding a steely edge, "it appears your company's claim is the one that's invalid. This charter predates the railroad grant by nearly a decade. According to the law, this man and his family are the legal owners of this valley." Croft's face went from smug to confused to purple with rage. "This is an outrage, a trick. The Montana Pacific will hear of this. You'll be ruined, Miller." "Maybe so," the sheriff said, his hand resting on his own pistol. "But today I'm upholding the law, and the law says this is Mr. Stone's property. I suggest you get on your horse and ride out of this valley before you're the one charged with trespassing." Defeated by the very law he had tried to wield as a weapon, Croft shot Jed a look of pure hatred, mounted his horse, and galloped away without another word. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to Jed. "Looks like you've got yourself a nice little piece of the world here, Mr. Stone. Good day to you." He mounted up and rode off, leaving Jed standing alone in the street. The saloon door creaked open. Elara ran to him, her face wet with tears of relief. Caleb, Leah, and Samuel followed, gathering around him. He looked at them, at the family that had crashed into his solitude and filled it with purpose and fear and a love he thought he'd never feel again. He put his arm around Elara, pulling her and the children close. He looked out over the main street, at the buildings that were no longer skeletal remains but the bones of a future. He had bought a ghost town for $50, seeking an escape from life. Instead, he had found a reason to live. "Welcome home," Elara whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Jedediah looked at her, then at the children, and then at the small garden they had planted together. "Welcome home," he agreed, and for the first time in a very long time the word felt true. The lonely rancher was no more. He was home.